Hey guys, I just wanted to continue the conversation of EdgeFlow and how it actually applies to a real 3D model and seeing how we actually leverage the EdgeFlow alphabet in practical terms, in terms of building an actual 3D shape. Because I know sometimes when you look at those shapes, you're like wondering, well, okay, so I get the idea of that, but within the context of, like I want to model cars and I want to model swords and weapons and all these different kinds of shapes, and all the things that you're going to be running into modeling all those different types of things are going to show up in these kinds of modeling scenarios. And to kind of show you how you can apply some of that thinking, let's take an actual kid's toy. Just like this Fisher-Price toy, it's the shape sorter. And there's so many different variations of this kind of toy, so it's really nice to see. One of the things I wanted to show you is that the language of EdgeFlow is definitely much in play. Now, right now I don't have the wireframe on, but when I turn on the wireframe, okay, you will see a difference in terms of what we're looking at. And at first it looks overwhelming. And if you look at this lid, this is where a lot of the work for building this model came from. All right. But if you start looking at the EdgeFlow patterns that got to it, let me go ahead and select that so you can see that from this angle. The truth of the matter is that a lot of those patterns are alive and well in being able to basically create these negative shapes. Now, believe it or not, before these negative shapes were built, I started with the actual positive shapes, which were the actual objects. Let me go ahead and bring those back. So these guys were very, very helpful and also instrumental in creating the lid. And I want to walk you a little bit through some of the process. I won't build the whole model for you because that would take a little bit of time, and to be quite honest, it did take a little bit of time. But I'm going to show you a little bit of the highlights of what kind of went into the building of it so that you can sort of see how you should be thinking about looking at hole cuts and die cuts and how they relate to parts fitting together, and the process that I took to use the EdgeFlow language to get what I need in the shape. For one thing, let's kind of start with the the positive forms. Let me see if I can pull these up right now. I'm going to get to that. Believe it or not, I started with forms that look like this. All right? And these were sort of the beginning points. Let me go ahead and turn on. So right now they're just hollow, but basically the goal was develop the outside train track or racetrack, so to speak. I know I need that to really be able to make these shapes. And there are a lot of different ways that you could have gotten those shapes. Again, for the cube, one of the ways I've got that rounded edge flow was literally simply just by taking a cube and then beveling it and then stealing that geometry from around it. All these shapes were kind of manufactured in that way. So again, if I wanted to make them solid, I'd fill the hole and then I would kind of play the game of connect the dots, or I would use quad draw to do that. So right now these are solid, but the edge flow is questionable because that's one big massive n-gon in the middle. If I turn those off for a moment and then turn on the edge flow for the shapes, you can see eventually I got to a place where I kind of filled in those patterns. And one of the things I tried to do is try to create an even distribution of the edges, the quad shapes, where I could. And again, some of the shapes made it a little bit easier to do than others. Usually in the corners is where you have some challenges in figuring out how to manage the topology. A lot of different ways you could potentially manage this. But this was the way I chose to do it. There might be some artists who might choose to do it a little bit differently. And again, you're going to have to look at the shape needs of your object to decide what works for you. Now, just so you know that there are variations, take a look at the way the star and the triangle was developed. Just because this was the one I ended up with doesn't mean that that was the only one that was potentially right. Look, I mean, you could have ended up with something like that. Only problem that I don't like about it is that this area is a little bit less evenly dense compared to the points. And so that would be the only thing, and that would be an issue for me if I were to bring this in to do digital sculpting, where at least with this, it's relatively broken up a little bit easier, so that if I ever had to go into digital sculpting, I've already kind of divided up some of this a little bit more evenly. But if you're not going to do digital sculpting, this would work perfectly fine in a game engine or some other place where it wasn't mission critical to have even topology like that. Same thing with the triangle shape. A lot of different ways to handle this. Now, again, I have a preference of the formation that I liked, and also this one was a little bit of a problem or pain because I realized that when I divided up my math, I was still going to have a different kind of way of dividing up this bottom part. And again, while I like this one the best, this could have worked too. This one is a little funky because I don't like the way this diagonal shape kind of cuts across. And so if I had to ever bend this object for whatever reason, you would get a weird kind of funkiness in the middle. So that's the other issue too. Are you going to do some animation? And let's say I had to kind of use a deformer. Let me go to nonlinear bend. Let me go ahead and add a little bit of curvature. Let me go and say 180. And then I'll rotate this accordingly. Maybe. And while there's no obvious rendering issue, I might be tempting fate by having that, where in fact it would have made more sense to maybe this part of the triangle to have a line dividing that in the middle. And we might create some weird funkiness with these shapes here. So that's a situation where, again, not ideal if you're going to be doing some animation or bending it in that direction. But this one would probably work fine, depending on how you would work with it. So again, same outer shape, same silhouette, but different approaches to filling in the middle. And that is going to be dependent on what your needs are for a pipeline down the road when you apply it to modeling situations. So let's say I got to this point where I created these shapes. Now the ones I did for the particular toy that I was talking about here, let me go over and turn some stuff off here. Those are a little bit different than these positive shapes, but they started out with that conversation in mind. The difference is that some of these actually have holes in them, so they have an added layer of complexity. Also, I made a conscious decision to not worry about whether or not these were going to be sculpted, and it was more important at the time for me to keep this more flat, and I was trying to be a little bit more efficient with my poly count. So I made a choice there based on where it was going to go, based on the rendering needs and a few other things. So it was a little different in even the way I managed the edge flow on the inside part of the shape. This one's a little bit more evenly distributed, but even here, not as elegant maybe as some of the other solutions that I was showing. But anyway, believe it or not, in order to get to this part, I had to start with these shapes. Now the key shape that was really, really critical to kind of develop this and kind of get them to do it, let me go and bring that, I'll just turn these guys off just for a moment. Okay, there you go. So, believe it or not, out of this, or those shapes, I had to kind of come up with this super shape. And I had to reconcile the silhouettes of those two shapes and get them to play nice within the context of a broader, larger shape. And this is where it starts to get a little bit creative. So what happens is that I had to reconcile these two things, and here's where it goes. I'm going to go over here, and I'm just going to select this outer rim here. I'm just going to go ahead and extract it so you can see what I had to start with. Okay. So that was the starting point because I needed sort of an outer limit for the lid. which is over here. All right, I needed that outer limit. And then I needed to extract the 3D form from shapes like this. And these had to be brought in together. So between this outer rim shape and these, I had to basically turn that into one piece of complex topology. And then from that point, I'd have to do a combine where Maya is looking at this as one piece of topology. And then from there, we're using a tool like QuadDraw to start connecting the topology together. And one of the challenges of doing this is that you're going to have to figure out a way to make this so that it works for your shape and still be somewhat efficient. So I might be going there, there. I'm going to connect that and there, and then here you're going to have to start kind of making decisions. Do I need to add an edge? There might be some of that you have to do where you're not compromising the shape. But literally, out of this, we're developing edge flow patterns to start filling in our shapes. And that is a process. And where it starts to get interesting is where you start getting shape connections like here, where it's less dense over here on this side compared to shapes here where it's a little bit more dense. That becomes a little bit of the challenge. How do you figure that stuff out? And sometimes it takes a little bit of an imagination to kind of get this stuff to play nice so that you can join these shapes with a little bit more imagination. And maybe it is a matter of kind of, and then maybe this one, and then you might have to again be creative with connecting the dots so that but that is part of the challenge of gluing these disparate parts. So you can see we're using additions and reductions in topology to kind of make the transition. In some cases we're reducing down, like here there's a lot more edges coming on this side compared to this. What's cool about QuadDraw is that it helps you at least search out for where the potential patterns could live, and then you can decide how you want to spread the wealth in terms of edge flow management. So again, maybe it is easier in certain sections to be able to make those connections. And again, it's QuadDraw makes it pretty easy to kind of offer some solutions, but you're still going to have to solve for the ones that are a little bit tough. And again, you may want something a little bit more broken up like this, maybe not as simple as this. If you were doing a game model or something that was a lot, where it didn't depend on 3-key smoothing, these transitions could probably be a variety of different size quads without worrying about even topology as much. You could probably do some of that variation. All right, so again, you're going to have to look at your topology needs and then make a decision on how you want to fill these out and how this wants to work. If you're working with 3-key smoothing, ideally you want to give yourself a good way to transition these shapes so that when you hit the 3-key, we're not getting weird pulls because we didn't have enough geometry buffering in these areas. All right, and if you look at the shape that I ultimately landed on, all right, let me go ahead and go to wireframe unshaded. Just to give myself insurance, I didn't give myself 1 row. All right, I gave myself 2 rows going around just to make sure that that shape would keep. Same thing over here. and then just to make sure that the integrity of this interior hull was maintained, and then whatever I did to reduce down and make connections. There you go. So this is probably the most complex part of the shape. Let me get rid of some of those patterns there. Go ahead here. So that was probably the most complex part of the piece, but you could see that it was necessary to kind of plan it out and get that together. So literally, a lot of this was starting building the positive shapes first, which were basically these guys, extracting the loops that I need, and you can see it's an easy factor of just kind of going ahead. So, you know, I'm going to grab that edge and then extruding outward to get that series of edges. Now, again, notice when you have a lot of edges, you probably don't want to go too far out, or else you'll get some weird pinching here. And then I'm going to go over here and then double click, extract, and that was the beginning of building a hole, which would be part and put into this situation here. All right, so that is sort of the process, and again, it's definitely methodical, but it takes a little bit of planning, one shape at a time, so you can work your way up to the complexity. All right. So anyway, that's a little bit of kind of how I got to building this particular shape. The language is there, guys. How to deal with round corners, you know, and that's really what it is. What you do with round shapes. If you have round corners, what are your edges doing to kind of create what Maya likes in terms of topology, and then playing connect the dots with the rest of that. Anyway, I'm hoping that this was helpful to kind of look at the process and see how things were built. And again, I know it wasn't spelling out everything in a blow-by-blow detail, but one of the differences for MCR is also to kind of give you the space so that you can start applying these principles to your own shapes and to your own parts of your models, so that this way you can be successful in being able to model practically anything you choose to set your mind to. And that's pretty much it, guys, in terms of managing complexity, managing positive shapes and stencil or hole cuts, negative shapes, in adding areas of detail to your 3D models.